yes, oh yes, we want to achieve. We're going to aspire. We're bound to be a success. Trinidad and Tobago will always live on. Colonialism gone. Our nation is born, everybody. We will follow our leaders.
Welcome back to the Now Morning Show, your wonderful Monday edition, but with a twist because, of course, it is the budget. We've been chatting right here on the Now Morning Show about some of the expectations or just what we're looking forward to. And we've seen some people also commenting on social media. A lot of people are interested in what's going to be happening in the realm of education. Now, I don't know about you, Rokas, but one of the things that definitely has stuck out to me is the continued conversation around distribution of devices and textbooks particularly. I was speaking to a teacher over the weekend who said one of the things that they were really hoping is going to remain in place will be the textbooks editions not having to be upgraded every single year.
Yeah. I think that's a scam, but that's just me. Sorry. I feel like
fine.
No, I really do feel like that because sometimes they change like 2 words or something and buy a whole new edition rather than pass down the edition to the next person. And I think they have lots of little things like that happen throughout our society. And I don't think we pay attention to realize how much money is wasted in that regard. And I don't mean just necessarily from us personally, but also from the government purse, because oftentimes just a little bit of a slackness is all that it takes for there to be another $1 million spent from the government that you can't get away from because, well, that's just how the policy is set up, you know what I mean? And people find ways to, I don't want to say milk, but to take advantage of the government purse where they can. And that's what we need. One of the things that we need to be sorting out is fiscal discretion and consistency. And this morning, lucky for us, we have an economist on the line with us. We have Dr. Vaalmikki Arjoon, who's a senior economist and lecturer in finance at the University of the West Indies. And he's joining us via phone this morning. Good morning to you, Dr. Arjoon.
Hello, good morning, Robert. Good morning to all the viewers in Trinidad and Tobago. Very happy to be on. I haven't been on PTT for I think a few years, so I'm really happy to be here again. Thank you for having me.
And we're very happy to have you back with us again. So let's jump straight into the conversation now, because of course today is budget day and we're all excited, we're all waiting with bated breath. But let's talk fiscal direction and consistency, because we've seen some policy shifts over the past 6 months impacting things like the TTRA and some of the suggested revenue streams that were on board. How do you believe the government will go about raising revenue to satisfy the election promises, or will they just rely on cutting expenditure? Which one are we looking at?
Right. So remember, this is the first budget from the new administration. It's a new government and a new party, and they tend to do things differently. So, in my view, if you look at how they operated between 2010 and 2015, they behaved more in terms of expansionary policies, meaning that it appears as though their style is to cut the taxes, increase spending in certain areas, and by cutting taxes and increasing spending, it is likely to stimulate more economic activities. Now, it was easier to do it back then because gas prices and production were very much in our favor. That is not the case right now and has not really been the case for the past 10 years, with the exception of 2022. But that wasn't because of any real strategic policy on our part. That was really because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Gas prices soared, right? Our public finances, and by extension the budget, are very vulnerable to the energy cycle. So when oil and gas prices and production are low, revenues will take a serious hit, which is a major reason we've been having the persistent deficits in the last decade.
Right.
And so in that regard, the energy companies would be paying less taxes, less royalties, less dividends to the states, and of course there's less foreign exchange that are necessary to grease the activities of the non-energy sector. And what compounded the deficits were deficiencies in our tax collections, and the limited growth in the revenue base of the non-energy sector was simply not enough to offset the drop in the energy revenues. Now, if I were to add all the deficits up since 2016 so far, till fiscal 2025, I would likely get a figure of 79 billion thereabouts, meaning that we would have spent about 79 billion more than what we actually earned in revenues over the last 10 years. Now, this year, we don't really have much of a choice. We have to embark on another deficit strategy because production still remains low. If you look at the data, gas production is about 33% lower than where it was in 2016. It's averaging about 2.41 billion standard cubic feet per day. The last time production was at this level was around 2003. Oil production fell by about 36% in the last decade. It currently stands at approximately 51,500 barrels, and that is actually putting us back to where we were in 1939. Now,
wow.
We're seeing another deficit, yes, but does a deficit have to be a bad thing? Last week, I would have looked at some IMF figures, some IMF data, and there's at least over 160 countries, I think it's 165 countries rather, that embarked on deficits, meaning they spent more than what they earned, consistently over the last 5 years, at least 165 countries. So a deficit doesn't really have to be a fiscal weakness, but it all depends on how the budget is structured, right? Our budget today is going to be read against the backdrop of an economy that is about 16.8% lower than where we were in 2015. In fact, we still haven't caught up to where we were in the immediate pre-pandemic era. We're still 5% below where we were in 2019.
Right.
Even though we grew a little bit, we grew modestly by about 2.5% last year. We're still 5% below where we were in the end of 2019. We still haven't caught up to that pre-COVID period.
Now, Dr. Arjoon,
yep.
Let me just jump in here to ask. You mentioned increased spending, of course, which would lead to the deficit, but it's meant to stimulate. But where's the money coming from to do the increased spending?
Right. So of course, government revenue tends, the bulk of it rather, comes from taxation, right? The standard taxes that are in place, given the legislation, and the bulk of their revenues come from that every single year. Last administration would have increased taxation rates in certain regard. They would have introduced new taxes, like, for example, the online spending tax. And, of course, they would have cut expenditure in certain areas to try to save money in order to be able to spend it on other obligations, right? But primarily, the money comes from tax revenue. Now, if you increase the increase the taxation rate, then, so for example, let's say you were to increase the tax rates from the corporation tax, which was done previously, from 25% to 30%. It's 30% now. If it's increased to let's say 35%, for example, then what that effectively means is that there's less disposable income to spend out there, right? To meet your household expenses, to be able to pay for your fuel, your travel expenses, and even in many cases, I heard you guys speaking about textbooks earlier, right? To meet your educational expenses and what have you. So it tends to restrict. It could very well restrict. Not could. It will restrict some form of economic activity. And in restricting economic activity is not necessarily what you want at this particular stage. What you want at this particular stage is for people to go out there and spend more, because in spending more, it creates more opportunities for businesses to make money, which in turn means when their revenue streams go up, their profitability increases, so that means they pay more taxes. Taxes specifically on income and profits, right? When the bulk of our taxes comes from taxes on income and profits. So,
but Dr. Arjoon, you mentioned reducing the taxes before. So how do we reduce the taxes but still increase the expenditure?
So in the past, they were able to reduce the taxes. I'm not suggesting that they do that now.
Oh, okay.
No,
okay.
I'm suggesting that they don't touch the taxes, don't increase it, right?
Okay.
If anything, leave it where it is.
All right, fantastic.
What I would like to see though is something being done about food prices, because food prices, you would recall, since the pandemic and thereafter, since the Russia-Ukraine conflict, food prices would have escalated. Now, internationally, there would have been instances where food prices normalized and they went back down. But in our case, that didn't happen, right? Food prices have not normalized locally. We tend to import a significant amount of the food that we consume every day, but the importers, the distributors, have not lowered their prices. In fact, when I look at some of the data, between let's say right before the pandemic, right till now, cheddar cheese increased by about 18%. The price. Margarine increased by 79%. Eggs increased by 40%. Liquid milk increased by 43%. Macaroni 56%. Prepackaged flour, 2 kilogram one, it increased by about 32%. Parboiled rice 33%. Vienna sausages 21%. Corned beef 41%. Red beans 59%. A pack of Milo increased by 17%. Chicken breast increased by 33%. So prices in general have continued to rise.
What do you think is responsible for this rise in prices that refuses to go back down?
Right. So you would recall that, for example, when there was COVID, and even when there also was the Russia-Ukraine crisis,
the tariffs, yeah.
Yeah, well, not so much the tariffs. The tariffs are more applicable at this particular point. But when there was the COVID issue, the COVID period, and businesses or the economies came out of lockdowns, there was a surge in spending. And when there was a surge in spending to make up for that time when they were in lockdown, of course, there was not enough production taking place to meet that high demand, so prices would have naturally gone up. And then there would have also been instances where there were not enough shipping vessels and containers available to be able to facilitate the international trade and the distribution of these items. And then even before that, we would have had instances where there were higher fuel prices at the pump because of the removal or the cutting back then of the fuel subsidy. There were increased taxes that I spoke about earlier that were passed on, the effect were passed on to the consumers because, of course, when you increase the cost or expenses in any form or fashion for businesses, they don't just accept it, they pass it on to the consumer, right?
Yeah. So, Doc,
the increased transportation costs led to higher shipping costs.
Right.
And, of course, we have a thriving black market economy here for foreign exchange.
Now, as you mentioned
that means the higher cost of forex is going to also compound prices in general, not just the food prices.
Right. So how do we then roll back on that food import bill? How do we reduce it using the national budget? What should we be looking for investments towards?
To reduce the food import bill, two things need to happen. One, and the effect of which is not going to happen overnight, especially the second effect, the effect of the second factor I'm about to mention. The first one is that we now in a tariff environment. Is it like that? Is it likely, or that we're going to see that there could be some form of either a tax or a non-tax barrier, right? Because you don't just have to tax things. If you want to reduce the importation of certain items, you can implement a non-tax barrier, right, to make it difficult to import certain food items. So technically, you're not increasing the cost of it, but you're just making it more difficult to import a particular item, or several items rather. So, for example, you can say, all right, well, these particular food items don't necessarily meet a particular quality that we would adhere to, a standard that we adhere to. So if it doesn't meet that particular standard, sorry, you can't import it. That's one thing. Another thing, you can simply put it on a negative list. If it's on a negative list, it simply means, sorry, you can't import it, but guess what? We produce it here locally, right? So what you have to do, rather, is incentivize the farmers, which brings me to my second point. Incentivize the farmers and the agricultural industry to ramp up their production to be able to maximize or optimize production per acreage in the shortest possible time frame, so that it could be able to help us to become more food self-sufficient, in other words, to be able to feed ourselves. That brings us now to a very important part that we're looking forward to in this budget. What's going to happen with respect to agriculture? Previously, we would have heard in the past, our former Minister of Finance would have said many instances that they're making the agriculture sector, a tax-free sector, right? Removing it of all tax burdens, right? Which sounds really good, but that actually has not happened. because there's, for example, I think it was last year's budget where they indicated removal of VAT and duties on importing machinery and equipment, etc., for the agricultural sector. That actually, I don't think that has materialized as yet. If you do that, that would reduce the cost burden, the cost of doing business burden for farmers, making it far easier for them to import the necessary items that are needed to facilitate their farming operations. But that's not all that we need to be doing. There's several simple, simple factors, or rather impediments to farming and agriculture in the country that we know about for many years that we still haven't been able to get a grasp on. Something like land tenure. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers in the country that still don't have land tenure. And if you don't have land tenure, it's like you're running an unregistered business.
Right.
So you can't go and you get a loan, you can't get financing. There's a litany of incentives by the agriculture sector, the agriculture ministry that ought to be provided to farmers that are there for the taking, but you can't access it if you don't have land tenure. The issues with pre-deal larceny, one of the things that they could consider doing is to decentralize the pre-deal larceny units and have more sub-units available across the country that could help take care of issues to do with pre-deal larceny. And something I've been trying to advocate for years, creating agricultural cooperatives across the country, and what this entails is you have several small farmers in various areas in the country. Why not bring them together and form a cooperative? So you're taking several small farmers and bringing them together to form a large farming entity, a large agricultural entity. That entity, they will share in each other's equipment, their machinery, their tractors, etc. They would pool their resources together to import the inputs like seedlings and what have you. The Ministry of Agriculture will also provide incentives to be able to help them to ramp up their production in the shortest space of time. And what could even help them further? A lot of people don't like to get into agriculture because of the so-called volatility of the market. Sometimes you might not get an attractive price, for example, for your vegetable produce. And sometimes the prices of them will actually go high. What NAMDEVCO could do is step in and say, all right, you have a cooperative here. We will guarantee you, we will take half of your production, half of your produce at this guaranteed minimum price. So they are guaranteed an attractive price for their produce, and if that price is to their liking, then it incentivizes them even more to ramp up their production. So that, and they know, because NAMDEVCO told them they're going to take half of their produce. So they know they have a market for it already. They have a buyer. So they ramp up their production. They get at least half of their production sold to NAMDEVCO at a guaranteed price. That could incentivize more individuals, more persons to get into farming and agricultural activities. There's a host of policies that we could talk about that could be implemented. But
now,
at the first instance, you have to fix the basics.
Doc, let me jump in here. Sorry to interrupt, but I know we have a lot of things that we can break down, because this budget is definitely one that we can look at many details and suggestions for. You mentioned we talk about agriculture and you talk about incentivizing the farmers. You spoke just now as well about the barriers to entry and all that good stuff. But I wanted to know, do you still think that we are placing too much emphasis and too much focus on the energy sector? I want to jump across to that conversation, because of course we know the dragon gas deal has been the hot topic in conversations. We have the OFAC license now for 6 months, which allows us to have some conversations to be able to say, can we get more out of this, or can we use this to our advantage? Tell me how you're feeling about it and what we should be looking forward to, and you know, let's talk about investor confidence and planning and all that stuff.
Right. So with respect to energy accounts for between 30 to 40% of our GDP, or our overall economy. So it's not about whether we're paying too much attention to energy. It's whether we need to pay a lot of attention to energy and a lot of attention to the other sectors.
Right.
So we spoke a little bit about manufacturing earlier. The manufacturing sector has performed remarkably well within the last decade or so. In fact, part of that was because of the COVID pandemic. Because of the pandemic, when countries were in lockdown, after they came out of lockdown, there was a surge in spending, as I indicated earlier. And because of that increase in demand, our manufacturers were able to take advantage of it by ramping up their production and selling to to these countries in the United States and Europe, the more developed destinations, to take advantage of that increase in spending. And there was also a surge in tourism activities in the region, in the Caribbean. And when there's an increase in tourism activities, it naturally creates an increase in the demand then for our local food processors. So the specifically non-energy manufacturing sector, it would have increased in terms of GDP size. It would have increased rather in terms of output by about 35% in the last decade. Okay. And food and beverage sector, the food processing sector, increased by 74%, a whopping 74% in the last 10 years, right? In fact, we should bring it up a bit further to the first quarter of this year. The food and beverage sector increased by about 13%. The non-energy manufacturing sector increased by about 9%. However, I mentioned just now energy is 30 to 40% of the overall economy. Yeah, the size of the energy sector accounts for 30 to 40% of the economy. Non-energy manufacturing accounts for only 7.5% of the economy. Food processing accounts for only 5.5% of the overall economy. So if we really want to get these sectors to contribute, and they've been doing well, don't get me wrong, but we want them to contribute more towards our GDP relative to the energy sector, then it's not going to happen overnight. It will only happen with the fullness of time. And these sectors need to continue to grow at an accelerated rate over the next few years. Now, coming back to the energy sector, I don't know if you might remember this, and this is the first administration, the first Kamala Prasad-Bissessar administration back between 2010 and 2015, when she was Prime Minister. I think it was 2013. They had adjusted the fiscal allowances to make it more attractive for the energy companies, right? As you might appreciate, the bulk of our gas reserves tend to lie in the deep water and the ultra-deep water, which are very risky for investment purposes. It has a lot of technical risk, operational risk, and, of course, significant costs attached to the exploration side. Mm-hmm. Energy companies not going to obviously take that lightly. There's several things they have to consider, especially the cost factor, before they can make an investment in our economy to go into those acreages and do exploration to try to find gas. And then finding gas is one thing. After that, you have to bring the gas from underground and send it for processing at Atlantic LNG, which is another aspect, right? So what then would, given that it's so expensive to do this, it very well gets into the billions of US dollars. What is going to stop them from taking that same money and investing in a low-cost jurisdiction where it's not deep water, is more shallow water or even onshore, but you could get a comparable amount of gas or even more at a cheaper investment level? You obviously have to incentivize them to want to stay here and keep that capital, that money here, and invest here. So in order to do this, in 2013, the government back then would have instituted some cost recovery measures known as accelerated capital allowances, right? So previously to that, these energy companies would have been allowed to write off their capital expenditure, right, which goes into the billions of dollars, over the space of 5 years. The government back then allowed them to write it off instead of over 5 years, and then they allowed them to write it off in 1 year time. And that incentive lasted until 2017. It was expiring in 2017. But when the new government came into office, they didn't agree with the policy. So after it expired, they did not renew it. So the policy was actually discontinued in 2017. That was not the only factor, but a key factor in reduced exploration activities from the energy companies, the BPs and the Shells and the Woodside, etc. So that is one factor that led to a reduction in exploration activities within the energy sector. So I'm looking forward to seeing this budget, if there's any fiscal incentives being put in place. Maybe they can go back to something like that in the past or something fairly similar to try to get the energy sector, these upstream companies, to ramp up the scale of their exploration activities. Remember, just now in January, they had launched the biggest ever bid round for our energy sector, the deep water aspects of our energy sector, but it only got 4 bids by two companies that didn't really have a presence here before. Why did we not get any bids from the typical energy majors, the Shells, the BPs, the Woodside, etc.? Was there something, it begs the question, was there something that they were not satisfied with respect to the fiscal terms and the returns that they were likely to get, that they were thinking that they could get from whatever acreages or whatever blocks then that were put on offer? So if the fiscal terms are not to their liking, they're simply not going to bid or are not going to invest.
Dr. Arjoon, let me just jump in here, and unfortunately we're out of time for this morning, but I definitely do want to continue this conversation because we do have a lot more that we need to discuss, and we can maybe do so after the budget as well. So I thank you very, very much for joining us this morning and sharing some of your thoughts with us, and we look forward to more conversations, yeah?
Thank you for having me. I'm supposed to be on TTT again on set tonight after the budget, so looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Dr. Vaalmikki Arjoon, Senior Economist and Lecturer in Finance at the University of the West Indies, sharing with us some of his thoughts as to what we should be looking forward to in the budget, which kicks off at 1:30 p.m. today. Stay tuned. We have a lot more on the Now Morning Show when we come back.
Oh yes, we want to achieve. We're going to aspire. We're bound to be a success. Trinidad and Tobago.
Fun times.